And welcome to FutureU. I'm Rubén Martinez, and with me is my colleague Frank Fear. We're both retired professors at Michigan State University, and we've had this forum on neoliberalism and higher education going now since about 2015, when we organized a conference here at Michigan State University. And with us at that time is our speaker today, Claire Polster, who gave a wonderful presentation. So today, what we're going to do is have her make a presentation, and then Professor Nathan Rousseau, who is over at Indiana University, Purdue University, Columbus. He's with the Department of Sociology and has been with us on previous forums. He's going to make some comments, and we'll give Claire an opportunity to also make some closing comments. Then I will close it out. So we'll go and get right into it. Professor Polster is professor of sociology and social studies at the University of Regina, Saskatchewan, and her research focuses on the ongoing transformation of Canadian and other Western systems of higher education and its implications for the public interest. She has published widely on neoliberalism and higher education, particularly on Canadian universities. She is greatly concerned about the privatization and commodification of academic research and the erosion of university autonomy, the erosion of democracy, the erosion of collegiality. She, along with Janice Newsom, who also has appeared on FutureU, is a co-editor of the book titled Academic Callings, the University We Had, Now Have, and Could Have, and also co-author with also Newsom, A Penny for Your Thoughts, How Corporatization Devalues Teaching, Research, and Public Service in Canada's University. She was also a co-founder of the University of Regina Faculty of Arts Community Research Unit. Claire, Professor Polster, may be reached at claire.polster@uregina.ca. She is going to be speaking today on resisting the neoliberal university. We've talked about how, we've been examining neoliberalism in higher education, but we haven't been able to launch any sustainable movement to resist and to bring about undo some of the changes that have occurred, and we need to be able to think about that. She has numerous publications on this topic, and a thread that runs through it all is resistance and the importance of resisting neoliberalism in higher education. So with that, Claire, turn it over to you.
Thank you. So to begin with, actually, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Regina, where I'm currently located, is situated on Treaty 4 land, which is the land of the Nahiawak, the Anishinaabeg, the Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and homeland of the Métis or Michif Nation. I want to express my deep appreciation for the generosity of the peoples who agreed to share this land with settlers. I want to publicly recommit to doing my part to ensure that treaty obligations are honored. And I want to encourage all of us to work to repair relationships between Indigenous peoples, the land, and settlers. It's actually taken me quite some time to be comfortable beginning my presentations with the land acknowledgement, because it seems to me that it's becoming the politically correct thing to do to signal one's own virtue. But I think it's really important that we understand that even our progressive work is built on a colonial, indeed genocidal foundation, and that we need to resist this. I have written a bit about the neoliberal university efforts to promote reconciliation and some of the links between them, and this may be something that we want to take up in discussion. I also want to thank Rubén and Frank for the invitation to speak today, and especially for building this community, which so many of us deeply need always, but perhaps especially at this moment. So sometimes an open invitation to speak is harder to deal with than a more specific one, because especially on the issue of neoliberalism in the university, there is so much to choose from. But what I most want to and will talk about today is responding to or resisting neoliberalism in the university. While it is definitely so important to understand the neoliberalization process and how it works, sometimes I feel like, just as with other social problems, we have a pretty good handle on the critique, but we fall short when it comes to what to do about it and how to do about it. So although most of my academic career has been about analyzing the process of neoliberalization, or as I have tended to call it, corporatization, and the problems associated with it, I've been trying to shift towards a focus on solutions. Now, whereas I thought that making this shift would not only be a more helpful, but also a more uplifting thing to do, both for me personally, but also for others in the university and society more generally, I actually have to acknowledge that this has been difficult and even disappointing work. On the one hand, I haven't come across too much successful systemic resistance to learn from and to share. And on the other hand, this work is somewhat problematic because you don't make change by writing about change, right? Change happens in actual practice. Change also doesn't and cannot take place in the same way everywhere, so it can't be prescribed. Despite these limitations, where or how I think I can contribute to resistance to corporatization is by examining and critiquing not particular efforts to make change, but more general weaknesses or gaps in our approach to change making. So for today, what I would like to do is to focus on two aspects of how we orient to resisting neoliberalization and to advocate for two shifts in our approach. The first, and this will constitute the vast majority of my talk, has to do with our general conception of how to make change. And the second, which I will just very briefly touch on, has to do with an important missing piece or a neglected aspect of our activism to which I believe we need to attend more. Before I launch into the talk, let me just say a few things about how I'll proceed. First, just so that you know and can pace yourselves, my talk will last about 35 minutes. Second, for reasons I won't go into, it will be in retro style. That is, it will simply be a talk. I'm not showing any slides, any animations, any video clips, other than this cute picture of an academic cat. So I will show you my cute academic cat, which is a visual for those of you who need your visual fix. So that's it. Finally, emphasize, third, to ensure that I'm on time and as coherent as possible, I'm going to rely on a pre-written text. And finally, I want to emphasize that I am going to be speaking from a Canadian perspective. Although my critique and proposals apply beyond the Canadian context, my examples are based on my experience and my research in Canada. Now, there's some key differences between the higher education system of Canada and the US, most notably that the Canadian system is mostly public. We have very few private universities in Canada. Despite this and other differences, though, I don't think that my Canadian focus is too much of a drawback, and it may even be a benefit, as sometimes it's easier to open to and to grasp an argument when it relates to someone else's experience rather than one's own, especially when they're somewhat, but not altogether different. So for those of us who've long been concerned about neoliberalization in North American and other universities, I would say that now's a particularly disheartening time. Not only do longstanding issues of managerialism, commercialization, the audit culture, surveillance, precarity, and others persist in our universities, but their renewed assaults on tenure, on academic freedom, and on the discussion, let alone remediation of inequality and social injustice. After so many years of grappling with critiquing and challenging neoliberalization, it's worth asking why our resistance is seemingly so ineffective. And while I don't claim to have a perfect, complete, or universally applicable answer to this question, I want to suggest that part of the answer lies in our approach to change making. So what I will do for most of my talk is to present and defend an approach to change making that may be more effective than the usual approach we apply today. And this alternative approach, which I will call the social relations approach and elaborate in a bit, aims always to transform the underlying relations that give rise to the institution we wish to change, rather than to reform or attack the apparent causes of that institution's problems. Now, in the interest of keeping your attention, while I talk briefly about this approach, I'm going to give you my punchline first. And that is that despite the fact that when they hear about it, most people agree that the social relations approach makes sense and may even be obvious, it seems notoriously absent and elusive when it comes to actions to oppose corporatization. When devising and implementing strategies, people almost invariably revert to attacking the apparent causes of our university's problems, which leaves corporatization intact and activists disappointed and demobilized. My goal today isn't to explain why people tend to slip out of a social relations approach and into what I call a cause and effect approach, but to show that they do this and how adopting the social relations approach can make better use of our energies and opportunities. At the end of this part of my talk, I'll also offer some suggestions to help us stay grounded in a social relations approach when trying to make progressive change in our universities. So let me start by taking 3 quick minutes to explain what social relations are, what a social relations approach involves, and how it differs from a cause and effect approach. So please bear with me. The talk, I hope, gets more exciting after this part. Social relations are the ongoing courses or patterns of human activity that give any institution its particular shape and form. The difference between an art gallery versus an art auction, or between a basketball game and a football game, lies in the patterns of interaction, the terms of engagement, or the social relations that make them what they are. All social relations have a two-way dynamic. They're produced and sustained by people's activity, but they also shape and constrain their activity. Like a complex game or a dance such as a square dance, they make it possible for people to come together and interact in certain ways, while at the same time restricting or preventing other possibilities. An approach to changing social relations aims always to reconfigure or redirect how people connect and interact at a fundamental rather than surface level. The goal is not to reform what people do, but to radically transform the patterns of interaction in which they're engaged. Taking our analogy of the square dance, your aim would not be to change the particular people who dance or the tempo of the music to which they dance, but to establish new patterns of movement and interaction that put a fundamentally new kind of dance, like a salsa or a line dance, into place. In order to successfully transform the social relations that constitute a complex institution like a university, you need 2 things. First, you need a solid understanding of how the institution is actually put together. And this kind of understanding doesn't come from cause and effect thinking or trying to explain why the institution is as it is. It comes from ecological or systemic analysis or trying to map how the institution is organized. Second, you need to develop strategies that help shift or reconstitute the institutional terrain or ground rather than target any single specific cause of the institution's problems. To help clarify what this means and how a social relations approach differs from a cause and effect approach, consider 2 different ways we might understand and respond to a child's illness. A cause and effect approach would lead us to ask why the child got sick and to explain the child's illness as the effect of their catching a bug. In response, this approach would lead us to give the child a pill to kill the bug that is the cause of the disease. In contrast, a social relations type of approach would have us explore or map how the child's illness arises out of various interacting factors or conditions, including the quality of their nutrition, the state of their immune system, the health of those in their community, and various environmental conditions around them. This more systemic understanding would lead us to develop strategies to shift the ground or conditions that underlie the child's ill health, improving their nutrition, strengthening their immune system, etc., in order to diminish the possibility and not only that particular instance of disease. Now, my guess, or at least my hope, is that most people can see the virtues of the social relations approach. Nonetheless, when it comes to making change, many of us revert to cause and effect thinking and action, seeking to attack the apparent causes of our university's problems rather than to reorganize its constitutive social relations. So in what follows, I'm going to give 3 examples of popular strategies that people have taken up to resist corporatization that exemplify this cause and effect approach. And I don't offer these examples to disparage the people who put valuable time and energies into them. On the contrary, I do this out of respect for their efforts and intentions and a desire to prove their outcomes. So the first and probably most popular strategy that people in Canada and elsewhere adopt to oppose corporatization is to lobby for more public funding for higher education. And this strategy stems from the belief that lack of funds caused our universities to turn to the corporate sector for support and to service corporations in return for that support. The solution that follows from this explanation is to lobby for increased public funding so that our universities can regain their independence from industry and revitalize their public service mission. Rather than seeking and targeting the reason why our universities are oriented towards serving industry, the approach I advocate would have us explore how university-industry relations are actually organized. And when you look for this, you see that over the last 4 or so decades in Canada, and I'm aware that this has gone on differently and for much longer in the US, governments and others have established various practices and programs that hook up or bring university and industry people closer together. So for example, they've increased the number of corporate executives that sit on higher education policymaking bodies and the amount of public money and programs that support industrially oriented academic research. They've also created various new positions on and off campus that promote university industry partnerships and various institutions like centers of excellence and research parks to enhance universities' contributions to industrial innovation and competitiveness. Taken together, these developments bring university and industry people into contact more often and in new ways that progressively cede control over university resources to the private sector at the public's expense, not industry's expense. When you attend to how university-industry relations are actually organized, you can see that putting more money into higher education, as it is presently constituted, is an ineffective, if not counterproductive strategy. More money will not fundamentally undo the new relations between universities and corporations. On the contrary, it may entrench and intensify them, much as pouring water down a mountain entrenches existing streams and channels. If we want to resist corporatization, we need first to redirect the patterns or pathways through which those in the university are hooked up to those outside of it, so that they reorient to serving public needs and interests rather than private ones. There are many ways to do this that we can take up in discussion. These include transforming government research funding programs and councils so that they support more basic and undirected research, restricting universities' involvement in various entrepreneurial ventures, and creating new positions and offices to promote university partnerships with community and public interest groups. The point is that once and only once we have reorganized this terrain or transformed the politics of the use of university funds, will it be a good idea to seek more funding for higher education, because only then will funds flow through channels and support actions that we intend rather than oppose. A second increasingly popular strategy to oppose corporatization is to alter the indicators that are used to assess academics and universities' performance. This strategy stems from the belief that the reason why academics are prioritizing private over public needs and interests is because the measures by which they're assessed do so as well. The solution that follows from this explanation is to alter these indicators so that they accord more value to public serving activities and thereby to get academics to do the same. Rather than seeking and targeting the reason why academics are favoring certain kinds of work over others, the approach I advocate would have us examine how the context of academic decision-making, or how academic autonomy and accountability are actually organized. And when you do this, you see that over the last 4 or so decades in Canada, various policies, practices, and technologies have been put into place that transform faculty from publicly oriented professionals into nervous employees who increasingly focus on their own interests and the interests of those on whom their well-being depends, managers, funders, etc. Indeed, performance indicators are themselves one such technology. These indicators limit academics' ability to autonomously define and pursue their own agendas by forcing them to account to management for what they do, and to do this in management's terms and according to managerial, not academic priorities. Further, because they're used not just to assess, but also to rank faculty in universities, these indicators convert academics from colleagues into competitors who are increasingly insecure and preoccupied with their own well-being. This alters in turn how academics relate to and interact with various other constituencies outside the university. Rather than asking, what can I do for others? Faculty are increasingly asking, what can others do for me? And opting for choices that produce the best outcomes for themselves. When you attend to how the context of academic decision-making is actually organized, you can see that changing the particular indicators used in the university is not a helpful strategy. While different indicators might make some academics more comfortable or successful in their work, They do nothing to alter faculty's subjection to managerial exigencies and values, to ease competition between and insecurity among academics, or to diminish academics' instrumentalism. On the contrary, by focusing only on altering these indicators, our actions actually serve to entrench and legitimize them and the social relations they put in place. If we want to restore a public serving ethic to our universities, we need to reorganize the ground or the context of academics' decisions and actions. And there are many ways to do this that we can address in discussion. These include replacing performance indicators with more robust and creative means of accounting for academic work. These also include establishing programs, positions, and institutions whose mandate is to enhance rather than measure academics' performance, so that faculty may focus on better serving the broader society rather than on performing for their bosses to protect themselves. The point is that if we wish to get rid of corporatization, we must not reform what we do, even if it's with a progressive twist, like creating public serving indicators, but we must transform the underlying organization of the institution. We will not restore a public service ethic to the university by convincing our managers to instruct us to do this. We'll restore it by establishing new relations in the institution that support and nurture a public serving culture. My final example of a strategy to resist corporatization, which has been taken up in several universities in recent years in Canada, in the US, I'm not sure about the UK for our UK visitor, but they can tell us, is to attempt to oust or to re-educate its senior administrators. This strategy stems from the belief that the reason why our universities are increasingly corporate and undemocratic is because their leaders are unfamiliar with or unfaithful to academic norms and values, and treat universities like any other private corporation. The solution that stems from this explanation is to replace these leaders with less corrupt or more enlightened ones who will respect our universities' public and democratic values. Again, rather than seeking to targeting the reason why our universities are becoming so corporate and undemocratic, the approach I advocate would have us examine how university governance is organized. And when you do this, you see that over the last 4 or so decades in Canada and elsewhere, various policies and practices have been put into place that progressively diminish the ability of faculty, students, staff, and community members to shape and influence institutional decision and policy making. These changes include the displacement of collegial with documentary forms of decision making, whose parameters and products are controlled by administrators, the stacking of collegial bodies with representatives of management, and the growing use of consultative and other practices like town halls and coffee breaks with the president that give people a say, but no real power. Taken together, these changes narrow the range of voices and considerations that may be entered into university deliberations. And when you add into the mix the closer relations between universities and corporations that I spoke about earlier, you can see how conditions that allow corporate values and practices to predominate are created. When you attend to how university governance is actually organized, you can see that replacing individual administrators with others is not an effective strategy. More enlightened administrators may be nicer to have around, but they're subject to the same pressures and bound by the same rules and procedures as are their less popular counterparts. If we want less corporate and more democratic universities, we should change not the individuals that lead them, but the patterns of interaction through which decisions and policies are made. As I implied earlier, we shouldn't change the dancers, we need to change the dance. There are many ways to do this that we can take up in discussion. These include collectively boycotting university decision and policy processes that restrict meaningful participation and initiating new ones like alternative and participatory budgeting processes that do. These also include revitalizing and coordinating the operations of collegial bodies so that more voices and values may inform institutional policies and decisions, and creating new bodies like the now defunct University of Toronto General Assembly to open up new avenues and opportunities for university and community groups to shape university decisions and agendas. I would further note that investing our hopes and energies into changing social relations rather than individuals will not only increase the likelihood that our universities become less corporate and more democratic, but that they stay this way, for these new relations will constrain all future administrators to operate in ways we've institutionalized, regardless of their particular personalities and preferences. So I hope that through these examples, I've shown why and that we should adopt a social relations approach when trying to resist corporatization in our universities and also elsewhere. In closing this main part of my talk, I'll offer 4 strategies or safeguards to help us stay grounded in this approach and avoid the easy and tempting slide into cause and effect thinking and action. The first suggestion is to begin always by asking how the institution we want to change is organized rather than why it is as it is. Answering this question requires research and investigation rather than speculation or theorizing. A helpful way to remember this is to always look towards the ground to discover the underlying relations that give rise to the institution we wish to change, rather than turning towards the heavens to ask for explanations of why things are thus and so. Why? If we do this, we're more likely to orient towards reconstructing the institution's terrain, rather than taking aim at any single cause of its problems. I think one reason we often avoid or slip out of a social relations approach is that it seems overwhelming to try to reconstruct the many complex patterns of interaction that constitute our universities. So my second suggestion is that we accept that we can't change university relations all at once and focus our efforts on changing those relations that will have the most significant impact. If you think of social relations as various interweave threads that make up the fabric of the university, we should seek to pull on those threads whose extraction alters the fabric as much as possible. My favorite example of one such thread is to prevent, by law or other means, the university's involvement in the privatization or commercialization of publicly funded research. Making this one change would help weaken or challenge various features of our corporate universities, including greater managerialism, increased secrecy and competition in research, escalating tuition fees, and the suppression of alternative knowledge. Pulling out this thread would also loosen up various others, making it easier to pull them out when their time comes. Third, when putting new strategies into place to help alter institutional relations, we need also to remain vigilant and create safeguards to protect them against institutional capture. A quick example illustrates the point. Years ago, some of us created a community research unit in our faculty to serve the needs of disadvantaged groups who couldn't afford to pay people to do research for them. The idea was not just that the unit would do different kinds of research, but that it would transform university community relations and help reverse corporatization by providing a vehicle for faculty and others to revitalize their public serving activities and commitments, and by encouraging the public to see the university as their resource, which they were free and encouraged to draw upon. Over time, however, the unit has been incorporated into and has incorporated itself into various university funding, auditing, reporting, and other practices that divert its time and energy from more transformative activities and goals. Although it still does great research, it is fair to say that it has been changed by the university more than the university has been changed by it. My final suggestion is that we resist the temptation to seek the immediate or quicker gratification that comes from targeting causes, especially as we get daunted by the hard and slow work that the social relation approach often involves. For although reconstructing social relations is far more difficult and fraught than shooting magic bullets, I hope I've made the case that it can yield far greater returns and more lasting returns. While this suggestion is pertinent in any context, I think it's especially so in today's context when things seem so threatening and so dire and we feel an urgency to respond. While I understand and share the feeling, I'd suggest that right now it's all the more important that we take our time to do the slow and careful analysis to ensure that we pursue the right things, and the slow and careful work to ensure that we mobilize in the most effective ways. Now, in the remaining time, I'd like to shift gears and make a second observation and suggestion with respect to resisting corporatization. So this is a very big shift right now. This second observation and suggestion has to do with an issue that's getting a lot of attention in the university these days, namely mental health, broadly understood as personal and interpersonal well-being. Needless to say, the ways in which this issue is being deployed in our universities is highly problematic. By default, if not by design, it serves to individualize, pathologize, and responsibilize people for issues that are not of their own making and that are beyond their capacity to remedy as individuals. At the same time that those of us who are truly concerned about university members' mental health would do well, at the same time that those who are truly concerned about university members' mental health would do well to attend more to the neoliberalization process that is at the root of much of this unwellness, I also want to suggest that those of us who are concerned about neoliberalization or corporatization would do well to attend more to the issue of mental health or wellness. However, we need to do this in a different way and for a different reason. It seems to me that many, if not most, analysts of university corporatization, myself included, tend to focus on how the process transforms the structures within which people interact, rather than on how it transforms the dispositions of those who do the interacting. This is a serious omission, for in a multiplicity of ways, corporatization dispirits and divides those who work and learn in the university, cultivating insecurity and self-interestedness instead of confidence and solidarity. This in turn deprives us of crucial personal and collective resources that we need to undertake and sustain resistance to corporatization, and thereby entrenches the process. If we see personal and interpersonal malaise not simply as a side effect, but as an integral feature of corporatization, it follows that as part of our efforts to oppose the process, we should directly confront this issue. That is, we should develop strategies that rebuild and reinvigorate our spirits, commitments, and connections, and by lifting us up, help bring corporatization down. Now, of course, raising spirits and rebuilding connections are not sufficient to reverse university corporatization. It's also true that these goals can be achieved indirectly as byproducts of more direct challenges to corporate structures such as occupation, strikes, legal proceedings, and others. Nevertheless, given that these objectives may be less threatening and more appealing to members of the university community, and that they can increase the likelihood that other acts of resistance will succeed, there's good reason to pursue them. Indeed, because even the impulse to resist is unlikely to be sustained in a demoralized and fragmented university community, one might argue that right now, such efforts should even be prioritized. In approaching this issue of personal and interpersonal well-being, we need to work in the same ways I discussed earlier. That is, we don't want to ask why we are dispirited and fragmented, but rather how we are dispirited and fragmented in and through the corporatization process, and how we can reorganize the ground to undo and repair the damage. Now, in another paper of mine, to which I can provide a link, I discuss 7 ideas and initiatives, including the production of the University of Aberdeen's Reclaiming Our University Manifesto and the Corporate Unmapping Project at the University of Toronto, and show that and how they reorganize relations within and beyond the university in ways that raise spirits and cultivate connection and solidarity. Due to lack of time, I won't elaborate on these right now, though we can certainly address them in discussion. The reason why I wanted to just flag this issue, if only briefly, is because I think that personal and interpersonal well-being is an important piece that we not only tend to neglect in our discussions of neoliberalization and resistance, but actually feel kind of cringy about, if we're being honest. Many of us prefer to talk about big structures and policies, and we are very and legitimately suspicious and nervous about psychological discourses, and especially about all the recent wellness hype. However, I think it's important for us to understand that and how corporatization is not only produced and sustained by changes to policies and structures of our institutions, it's also produced and sustained by changes within ourselves. Attempting to revive our aspirations and our expectations of members of public serving institutions, and also to reestablish connection and solidarity within and beyond the academy is therefore neither trivial nor secondary work. Rather, it constitutes both a direct and indirect challenge to corporatization, undoing some of the personal and interpersonal damage that holds it in place, and paving the way for additional acts of resistance to follow.
Thank you, Claire, for that insightful approach and that excellent presentation. We'll now turn to Nathan and hear comments as in his role as discussant.
Well, thank you. There's a lot of places to go, Claire, in terms of the things that you said. And I think some of the key things that I picked up on I'll elaborate on that. This is definitely a necessary conversation to have, which is let's focus the questions less on why than on how. And I think that's definitely necessary. Part of the problem, and you referred to this, is that these kinds of conversations need to become more widespread. And it's one of the things that I really appreciate about what Frank and Rubén are doing, is that they are trying to expand this conversation to more and more people. It's interesting to me how people are somewhat resistant to even having these kinds of conversations. And I think that really says a lot about the mental state of individuals. One of the other things that you talked about was that, yeah, I mean, we can talk and talk and talk, but talk is really useless without action. And one of the things that I picked up on that you spoke about was forming new relations, new organizations. And I would really like to see faculty organizations form somewhat independently of the university, but within the university. Basically, like maybe not be so open or blatant about it, but kind of anti-neoliberal faculty groups, as well as faculty community groups where faculty would meet with, say, educators or families in order to have a conversation outside of the corporate bubble that we are all living in. I mean, I think these are all really great ideas, and I would love to see some of these things happen. In essence, really a part of what we're talking about are developing strategies to change the culture of an institution. And that is really challenging, especially given the current hegemony of neoliberalism. One of the things that I always come back to is that capitalism, in particular neoliberalism, is just so good at commodifying dissent, so that people begin to recognize what the issues are, and ultimately what they do is buy a t-shirt. I'm reminded of, I saw this gentleman wearing a t-shirt not too long ago that said something to the effect of, I'm the teacher that Fox News warned you about. And I got such a kick out of that. I had to go up to him and say, I really liked your t-shirt, but that's kind of the point that I'm making. Whoever sold that t-shirt probably got more out of the whole process than what the teacher got. And that's what I mean by commodifying dissent. And capitalism, and in particular neoliberalism, is extremely good at that. And I'll just make a few more points, and then I'll stop. One of the things that I wrote down is that corporatization feeds on the desire for individuation. it feeds on individuals' desire for individuation, particularly in more individualistic kinds of societies. And a lot of Western societies already have that predisposition. Neoliberalism just feeds on that. While at the same time, neoliberalism fuels precarity and fear. So on the one hand, corporatization feeds on the desire for individuation while fueling precarity and fear. Thus, it links people to corporatization while undermining individuation. The reason why this is so important is that one of the things that I think neoliberalism does inadvertently is increase daily life contradictions. And I don't think people like to think about this, but contradiction messes with mental health. And so if the case can be argued that there are more mental health issues today than, say, in previous decades, I would say that at the heart of it may be the dramatic increase in the daily contradictions that people live with. It reminds me of one of my favorite books, which was written by a psychologist about 30 years ago, and the title says it all. This is kind of like a watered down version of what this guy wrote about. And the book is called "We've Had 100 Years of Psychotherapy and the World is Getting Worse." And basically, what the author is saying is that we can go inside all we want, but the factors that are bringing people into therapy are not changing the social factors causing it. And, a lot of sociologists will go, well, yeah, of course, that's true. But sociology is really anathema to neoliberalism, which is, one of the reasons why it's marginalized more now than in the past. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Nathan. Claire, do you want to make any further comments?
Sure, I'll just make some quick responses to what Nathan said. I loved everything you said. I'll just, the only thing that I might take issue with, and I'm sure you will agree here, is when you said we should have anti-neoliberalization groups. I think what we actually need is pro-public serving university groups. I think so much of the time we focus on what we don't like, and there's ways in which our responses hook us into those same relations. So at the same time that we resist, I think it's really important that we think about what we would like to see and then put into place new institutions, policies, practices, relations that bring us in that direction, right? So for example, a lot of people are upset about the privatization of, people who are upset about the privatization of university knowledge. They might be upset and say, so we need conflict of interest rules, or we have to keep industry from preventing academics from sharing their knowledge. Whereas instead, what we might want to do is put into place policies that prevent, again, publicly funded research from being privatized to begin with, right? So that we have a conception of replenishing and contributing to the knowledge commons rather than just resisting. So again, and I'm sure you would agree with that, but I think it is important in terms of our stance. And I would also say, at least in Canada, many of the things that we couldn't put into place, and you alluded to that as well, we can set up any kind of institution we want, say outside the university, and even some things inside the university, like for example, a general assembly. You don't need administrative consent to do this. And also, I'm not sure that every single administrator would even be opposed. So we can, I think sometimes we don't think as big and as transformatively as we could. So that would be one thing. In terms of meeting with the community, I will just give a little shout out to somebody who I just discovered at a conference. You may know him, Kevin Kumashiro. Have people heard of him? Anyways, he gave an amazing talk. And I won't go into any of the details, but something he mentioned was, yeah, so I see somebody giving a thumbs up. He was talking about a conception of universities being similar to community schools and schools as community hubs, right? So trying to put that model into our conception and practice in the universities. So I really like that idea when you're talking about meeting with communities, maybe rethinking of our communities, not just as places that does research on behalf of the public, but actually becomes much more integrated into the community. In terms of the commodification of resistance, I completely agree with you. And I think we need to be really careful with how we deal with satire. I have a real beef these days about satire because I think a lot of people are happy to just, show that we understand things and we're so clever. But then in, enunciating our understanding of things, that's all we do, right? So we wear the t-shirt rather than going to the meeting. And so I agree with you that that is something we really need to be on the lookout for. And then the last thing I'll say is, I totally agree with you that there are major contradictions inside the institution. And I think that there's opportunity for us to exploit some of those contradictions to respond to neoliberalism. So for example, I'll just read something that I wrote. We can use the many problems associated with the expansion and intensification of academic surveillance and performance assessment, which include the consumption of substantial institutional resources, the growth of competition, secrecy, and fraud in academic research, and the production of significant stress and mental and physical illness for faculty to argue against corporate practices and their underlying assumptions and values. Similarly, the high costs and other risks associated with commercializing academic research, which include expensive lawsuits, threats to universities' charitable status, and reputational damage, can also be used to challenge corporate relations in our universities. So some of the contradictions that exist, I think you were arguing about their harm, and I agree with you, but they are also places of potential intervention.
Thank you. Very much appreciate comments by the both of you. I really, there's a lot of dimensions to neoliberalism and higher education. And I really appreciate your holistic approach. I think it's a very broad approach that takes into account both context and the external environment and internal environment and so on. There's a lot of different factors at play here. When we try to organize, we have to keep in mind that the shift of the university came about as a result of external pressures. And, someone once said, walk softly and carry a big stick. I think that we felt the big stick, but, neoliberalism was, at least here in the United States, was imposed kind of in stealth mode. We really didn't know what was happening until it had already happened, right? And then the approach from the external pressures was punitive, mainly through funding, performance-based funding, which basically said, if you folks don't get in line, we're going to cut your funding. And so that put a lot of fear in people, and it made them toe the line. So I really appreciate, looking at the external community and building allies, not only through research, but also we really need to work with legislators. And there's a lot of legislators who now understand that neoliberalism has pretty much wrought chaos and havoc in the broader society, and that we're seeing that in Florida, right? I mean, I understand there's faculty fleeing the state, they're wanting to flee the state, and Disney might flee the state, and so the war there has the cultural war there has maybe reaching the point where it's having more blowback than actual gains for those who are promoting it. I think it's very important to keep in mind too, and you're not the first to say that you've built a unit within the university and it got co-opted. The co-optational approach and power of the university is incredibly enormous. We had a speaker a couple of years ago who also created a unit and was actually saying, okay, let's co-opt the neoliberal model. Let's go ahead and start making lots of money and doing, research for communities and so forth. And his success led to blowback from the faculty who said, no, no, no. And I think it's partly that sort of superficial understanding of how these things work on the part of the faculty. I've also seen faculty move to replace administrators, only to get a tougher administrator replaced, because we can remove them, but we can't bring them in, right? Oftentimes those who bring them in are the neoliberal folks and so on. So there's a lot of different dimensions here, and I really appreciate you sort of bringing all of these different dimensions to bear on the conversation. And I would hope that those who are listening and who are going to be watching this and thinking about it will continue to take your advice and say, promote some internal conversations, think creatively, don't worry about the why, the how things are being done now, and see how we can transform them. So I really appreciate your comments and look forward to the conversations as we move into the future. Both of you, of course, are always welcome to come back with your ideas.